Hello, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion on Israeli perspective on American democracy. This learning session is part of a 2-week symposium entitled Judaism, Citizenship, and Democracy from the Shalom Hartman Institute. We are a pluralistic think tank and an educational center for the Jewish people. You can find out more about us and see more of our videos, articles, and podcasts at our site, shalomhartman.org. We are going to talk about Israeli perspective towards the American democracy. We've been spending the last 2 weeks talking about American citizenship and democracy. And obviously, the Shalom Hartman Institute is also, some would say primarily, an Israeli institute. And we, as Israelis, we would like to share with you what we think about Israeli democracy, about American democracy, how it looks from here, and what are the points of tension that we can find between the two democracies. Now, let me introduce my fellow panelists. First, Rabbi Dr. Shraga Bar-On, who is the director of the David Hartman Center for Intellectual Excellence, a research fellow at the Kogod Research Center for Contemporary Jewish Thought, and the co-head of the Beit Midrash for Israeli Rabbis. We have also Dr. Masua Sagiv, is a postdoctorate fellow at the David Hartman Center for Intellectual Leadership. Dr. Sagiv is also an academic director of the Center of Jewish and Democratic Law at Bar-Ilan University, Faculty of Law, and an adjunct lecturer in Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law. Myself, my name is Tomer Persico. I'm a research fellow and the current scholar in residence in the Bay Area for the Hartman Institute. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, and I'm a senior researcher at the Berkeley Center for Middle Eastern Studies. So welcome, and perhaps I'll begin with, I think, a general exposition about really the differences, the fundamental differences that I think are to be seen between the Israeli democracy and the American democracy. And I think that a lot of the times that we talk about democracy, we really talk about it as if it's a single thing, as if there's some specific standard that democracies need to live up to, and if they do, they're well-performing democracies, and if they don't, they don't. But really, looking a bit closer, we can hardly ignore the fact that the democracies are different. The French democracy is different than the British democracy. Certainly, let's say in the relationship to religion. The British have a formal religion, the Anglican Church. The British have bishops in the House of Lords, a part of the Parliament. And the French, of course, know nothing about that and would be shocked to even consider it. They have their laissez-faire sort of cultural and really statist secularization. So they're different. By the same token, I think we need to understand that the Israeli democracy and the American democracy are fundamentally different. The Americans established their state in the course of human events, as it were, right? It's a universal, rational project. It's a meeting of minds of immigrants that had no historical connection to their land, and they came together by virtue of what in the 17th century was known as the social contract, right? An idea, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, that was developed about how different people come together and in order to protect their individual rights and liberties, draw a contract between them and learn to live together in a commonwealth, right, in a republic. And I mean, that's what happened, right? That's what we the people are. We are people that came from different places, and we just agree rationally to live together according to a set of principles. Now, obviously, the state of Israel came into reality in a completely different context, right? It's a specific group of people, an ethnic group, a religious, a traditional group, who came together to a specific place and not any other place because of certain very ancient historical connections, with a clear idea of what they wanted to set up there, right? It's not a rational contract because there's no need to secure a national contract between people who are part of the same group, who see themselves as a sort of an extended family. And they have, as I said, a completely different goal before them when they come to establish a state. And what is that goal? Again, the goals are different. Returning to the US, to the United States. What is the goal of the United States? And I think we can simply quote from the Declaration of Independence. We all know by heart that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal and that they were endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great. Now, the very next sentence lays out that the goal of the state is to secure these rights. And the next sentence I'm quoting, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Like, that's what we have our government for. That's what we're doing all this for. That's what we're going to all this trouble, right? To secure our personal rights and liberties. Now, again, looking at the state of Israel, something completely different was stated as the goal. And let me read a line from the Declaration of Independence of the establishment of the State of Israel. And I'm reading, by virtue of our natural and historical rights, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel. Sorry. What's the natural and historic right here? It's not any individual right. It's a collective right. It's the right of the people, of the Jewish people, for self-determination, for independence, for self-rule, for sovereignty. That's the right we're talking about here, and the right that the United Nations recognized. And so we are going to manifest it. We're going to take it into the reality, right? So again, the State of Israel was not founded, at least explicitly, for the protection of individual rights and liberties of its citizens. Yes, because it's a democracy, it is also committed to that, but that's not the main thing. The main idea was to secure the right of self-determination to a collective, which is the Jewish people. Now, I think that if we judge the State of Israel by the democratic standards and genre of America, we find it, or we can find it, if not strange, sometimes lacking, right? Let's say, if we look at the State of Israel, and we see that it insists on describing itself as a Jewish state, from the point of view of a constitutional democracy, of a constitutional republic, that can seem wrong, or perhaps even racist. Why are you taking a certain ethnic group that lives within the boundaries of the state and making the state theirs, right? It's not every citizen's in a national way. It's only one specific ethnic group nationally. Well, is that wrong? Now, yes, if we're talking about the US, it's wrong. But if we're talking about Israel, it's simply at the fulfillment of what it set out to do, right? And here Israel is in the same boat as other ethnic nation states, which are also democracies like Japan or Greece or Turkey or Spain, etc., etc. There's no real difference. These states are nationally belong to some single ethnic group, with, of course, allowing other ethnic groups to enjoy protection of their fundamental rights, etc. That's what makes them a democracy. And so this can go on to other subjects or other ways of seeing Israel that, from an American perspective, make Israel to seem to be doing it wrong, to be doing the whole democracy thing wrong. But from an Israeli point of view, that's just simply not the case because they're doing something else, a different kind of democracy. It can be also religion and state that maybe we will go into later. And so I think with this as background, I want to go further and to go on to the first question that I want to present my esteemed and lovable colleagues, and ask about, again, a view from the United States towards Israel that we may find, let's say, sometimes problematic. And the question is about American Jews' support for a candidate or a party that is based primarily if they perceive when they perceive the candidate or the party to be better for Israel or good for Israel. And I want us to reflect on this behavior from an Israeli point of view. How do Israelis understand American partisanship, particularly within Jewish circles? To what degree do Israelis think American Jews should consider how American politicians view the state of Israel and their commitments to the state of Israel when voting? And I want Masua, please, to begin considering this.
Thank you, Tomer. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I think I want to relate to what you said earlier, Tomer, about people interpreting or states interpreting differently specific expressions that we might think have a similar definition. So we can talk about democracy, and we also can talk about Jewish peoplehood, which is perhaps an expression that we all think we know what that means, but really we have gaps of understanding between perhaps American Jews and Israeli Jews. And I think the question here that you are trying to ask is really a question of Jewish Israelis. I should say, by the way, we're using the word Israelis here, but we really mean Jewish Israelis, and we should know that. So anyway, as I said, I think the question here is a question of Jewish Israelis' perceptions of Jewish peoplehood. Because the first option is that Israel is the center of the Jewish people, and world Jewry are or should be something like orbiting around it, okay? So this is the perception of the negation of the exile and perhaps a very strong affinity to Zionism, and the Israeli nation-state law stating that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people is at some extent a manifestation of this perception. It's not completely so, even in the nation-state law, but that's not our topic today, so I'm not gonna, I won't go into detail. So that was the first option. The second option is that Israel is central or meaningful, but not the center of the Jewish people today. So the first option creates a wide set of expectations from American Jewry. On the one hand, not to interfere in what's happening inside Israel, and perhaps we'll talk about that more later on. And from the other hand, to politically support Israel, including when voting. But the second option puts forward a more complex framework of attitudes and expectations, because under this option, Jewish life outside of Israel is, well, first of all, it's a fact, and more than that, it's crucial to the Jewish people. It's how it's supposed to be today, and Israel can and should be a consideration for American Jewry's political behavior, but not the sole consideration. And for that reason, Israelis should not expect American Jewry to vote according to what's best for Israel, or not only according to what's best for Israel. By the way, the same is true the opposite way. If we adopt this conception of Jewish peoplehood, then Israelis should also take into consideration world Jewry when they're voting or making political decisions. I think that's it for now. Perhaps I'll elaborate more later.
No, thanks, Masua. And this actually reminds me, Shraga, let me give an anecdote. It reminds me that I heard Tehila Friedman talk. Tehila was a long time member of the fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Now she's a parliament member. That's the usual course of development for us. And she was talking at a panel and saying that that Americans are like shocked when Israelis love Trump, and Jewish Americans are saying to them, "Don't you understand what he's doing to the U.S.? Don't you understand that he's a danger to the way we live?" And Tehillah said that she would answer to them, "What about you? What about your support for the Iran deal? What about your support for Obama's attempt and success in securing this deal? Don't you understand what it does to Israel?" And from Tehillah's point of view, it was a very negative development in like the geopolitical security standing of Israel. And so the expectation is in both directions, but Tehillah expresses what you said about this expectation that if we are the center of the Jewish people, please vote accordingly, right? And don't endanger us, at least in areas that we think are dangerous, etc. Right.
Right, but as you said, it cuts both ways. So maybe we should adjust our expectations on American jury vote to address the need to secure their country, your country in this case. But Masua, you said that we are talking about Israelis and we mean Israeli Jews. Sometimes we are talking about Israelis, we mean us, basically. And I must admit that I and probably you, my fellow panelists, are much more bothered by the US election than many Israelis once in this past year. The majority of Israelis are unconcerned by it and are not bothered. On the one hand, I think this is a very good sign. It means that at least for Israelis and at least for this round of election, the bond between us is stable. The bond between our nation is still bipartisan, and Israelis see the Democrats and Republicans as partners. And in my opinion, it is very important. This was neither the case, as you said, Tomer, in the previous US election, nor in the Democrat primaries. In past election, we have been very concerned by both sides, whether after 8 years of the Obama administration or after, especially after the Iran deal, which you mentioned, and also by the personality of the current president. The present election do not trouble Israelis, say, very generally. And this means that both candidates are seen as potential partners and as allies. That being said, why am I bothered? I'm bothered because this polarized election reflects a process of deep erosion of the US-Israeli alliance, not only concerning our common interests, which I think are quite secured, but our shared values. Despite the fundamental differences that you, Tomer, spoke about, we have so many essential points of similarity, which in my opinion is fascinating. We are so similar that even the current crises are being experienced almost similarly. Both Israel and US are liberal democracies in crisis, and we must say this to ourselves loud and be honest about it. The crisis is first and foremost one of values. The Talmud says that the appearance of the generation is like the appearance of its leader. The difficulty in cultivating leadership is not momentarily. The difficulty reflects the future in our shared ethos. Our bond rests on shared ethos that have been represented by both sides for years, and I hope this will continue. For years, both countries have represented a balance of liberal position, a position that believes in check and balances between different branches of government, rule of law, and the promotion of human rights, while defending national interests, liberty, security, and the economy. This liberal position, this basic liberal position, has always been challenged by fundamentalists to the right and progressives to the left. This was our society's shared ethos. It gave us a sense of self-confidence, of self-esteem and solidarity. And in my opinion, it has been the basis of the US-Israel bond as well. In recent years, however, there is a strong feeling that this system has been corrupted. Politics has been stripped of values. It is hard to believe, but lately the chairman of Israel's coalition has expressed what politics without values is. Politics without values is about three things: power, money, and self-importance. Such politics is called corruption. Society in both our countries is more divided than ever, and it seems that a large part of the voices that were in the past marginal have become to the mainstream. And our shared ethos and our internal solidarity and solidarity with each other is more threatened than ever. In this toxic political culture, our thinking becomes dichotomous, and everything our side does is inherently good, and everything that the other side does is evil. I believe that both Israelis and Americans, precisely because of our democratic cultures, are not supposed to think dichotomously.
To think they what? They?
In a dichotomous way, dichotomously.
Yeah.
This is an unhealthy political culture, and it touches upon the topic of interests. You are right that sometimes deep in our hearts, or sometimes right on the table, Israelis wish that American jury vote in accordance with Israel's interest. But Israel's interests are not limited to concrete questions, but also to the very experience of partnership, of alliance. And as Tehillah said, you quoted Tehillah, I must admit, and I'm sorry to disappoint some of you. Actually, I told a friend of mine that I was going to say this, and he advised me not to share it with you.
Please do.
But I must be honest. This is the Hartman way, isn't it? In this, the Obama administration, unlike previous Clinton administration, for example, failed to convince Israelis that, that we are completely allies. And the Trump administration succeeded. Many of you may not like to hear this, but most Israelis think Trump has been an ally and true friend of Israel. Does
Right.
that?
If
Sorry?
I may say, I think you're absolutely correct. Factually, yes, the Obama administration did not convince. The Trump administration has the, the avowed support of most Israelis, of most Jewish Israelis, at least. That's certainly true. But how did it get there? I mean, how did Trump convince Israelis to support him? Isn't it by the same dichotomous type of thinking and politics that you said just a minute ago were something that we should be beware of?
Right, right. That doesn't mean that American Jews should vote for Trump. No. But from an Israeli perspective, yes, would it be impossible, an impossible expectation that our audience would look at moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, a promise that was shared by the Democratic administration as well, right? recognizing the Golan Heights, canceling the Iran deal, and pushing various peace agreements, which actually has started by the former administration. Chaim Saban celebrated there not by accident, right? So promoting peace agreements with the Arab world are successes of Trump. So therefore, I wish that liberal Jews won't identify this policy as a monopoly of the Republican administration. But on the contrary, I would like to believe that the Democratic Party will be able to adopt an approach that more clearly and more generously expresses friendship with Israel, and that, if elected, it will try to advance those policies while expressing full partnerships with Israel. And I believe that those who want to see Israel moving along the lines of the Democratic Party have a better chance to see it if the Democratic Party will be full-hearted ally, supporter, generously supporter of Israel.
I agree, and I have something to say about this, but I want to ask Masua if she has something more to say about the limits and opportunities of American Jewish engagement with Israeli politics.
Thank you. I just want to say that it's something more than just convincing the public in Israel that either administration cares and works towards what's best for Israel. And I think that's something that is also in common in both Israel and the United States, and have something to do with the dichotomous way of thinking you just mentioned. And that's this is a struggle on the identity of these countries. This is a struggle of the shared values, of what values we adopt and what values we reject. So it's true that the discourse is very polarized, and that the discussions are people are hurling stigmas and insults one on another, but substantially this is a struggle on the identity of Israel and the identity of the United States as a liberal or as a conservative liberal democracy. And again, I think that's something that is very evident in both sides' perceptions of Jewish peoplehood and the relationship between Jewish Israelis and American Jews. And a few days ago, Omer Yankelevich, the Minister for Diaspora Affairs, together with Tehila Friedman, submitted a bill according to which government ministries will be required to connect and consult with diaspora Jews on Israeli issues that affect Jews worldwide. And as other initiatives dealing with an involvement of world Jewry in Israeli affairs, this bill was received with great suspicion and criticism, and the basic argument among the public is that the interference of American Jewry in Israeli affairs is both conceptually and practically mistaken. So from a conceptual point of view, such interference is infringing upon Israeli sovereignty and citizenship. And it's important to note that this criticism can come both from the right and from the left. Okay, so from the left, such interference grants voices and perhaps influence to non-citizens at the expense of marginalized citizens, namely Arab Israelis. And from the right, it infringes upon the sovereignty of the state. From a practical point of view, it's evident that ideologically, Israeli Jewry and American Jewry are the mirror image of each other, right? And so it is perceived that giving American Jewry a say on Israeli policy is trying undemocratically to change the ideological and political balance in Israel, from being conservative to and right-winged to being liberal and left-wing. Of course, examining this from a viewpoint of Jewish peoplehood, that Israel is a part of, but not the center of. Israel claims to speak in the name of the Jewish people and is perceived by many in the world as such. It also holds the monopoly over Jewish sacred places. And if that's the case, Israel has some sort of a constitutional duty towards world Jewry, and this duty ought to be performed while hearing their actual voices rather than deciding alone what's best for them. But at the end, again, I'm saying this is an ideological struggle over the identity of both, I think, Israel and the United States. And obviously it coexists with the internal struggle of what Jewish peoplehood really means.
I totally agree, Masua. And I have to reply to what Shraga said before. I mean, and again, about the perception among Israelis that the Obama administration was not, let's say, the most supportive, to put it mildly. I mean, that perception is also the result of a quite largely invested, propaganda maybe is a harsh word, but this is a political job done by the Netanyahu administration, by the Netanyahu government. Netanyahu has been prime minister for the last decade more, and so in spite of the Obama administration being I think factually the largest spender in terms of money on the Israeli security system, weapon systems, etc., the perception was constructed that Obama is opposed to Israel because the Obama administration demanded a freeze of settlements and wanted to pursue a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians that would have split the land of Israel into two. While the Trump administration, apart from the real moves that you mentioned, Shraga, embassy and recognition of the Golan Heights, etc., also simply did not demand any concessions regarding the settlements, right? And when we understand that this is a very large elephant in the middle of the room, we need to acknowledge that it's not only like a misstep on the part of the Obama administration, not being nice enough or talking gently enough or something like that. It's simply the Obama administration demanding things that are, correct me if I'm wrong, in line with the general, very, very decade-long policy of the United States, and concerns also what Masua just said, concerns the identity of the United States and really of Israel as liberal democracies. So the minute there is a demand to fulfill the sort of presumptions or theoretical commitments that we, as a liberal democracy in Israel and the United States, as a liberal democracy which also sees itself as having a large role in the international community, are making, the minute there is a demand to actually stand up and live up to these commitments, Israel sees this as an infringement of, I don't know, the great friendship between the two states, and starts complaining about it. But really, there is nothing here more than what Masua called simply our identity and commitment to our ideals.
Although, Tomer, I have to say just one sentence, and I don't have the answer for it, but just a thought experiment. If tomorrow President Trump says, okay, I demand that you evacuate these that settlements, do you think the popular, that he'll become less popular in Israel? I'm not sure.
Wait a minute.
You're thinking that it's the settlements. I'm just saying about.
I think so.
Specific point. I'm not sure.
No, the settlements are a very vague conception. But if the Trump administration would develop and present a peace agreement that splits, that actually really, gives the Palestinians a state, a full-fledged state in the 67 borders, I think public opinion will change about him in Israel, and I have some proof of this. I remember, I'm old enough to remember, that George W. Bush was a greatly admired president on the part of Israelis when he invaded Iraq, and I remember even like falafel joints naming themselves George W. Bush Falafel. This from Jerusalem. I actually remember that, and the public opinion changing when what was called the roadmap was presented to Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister of Israel, and really demanded that Sharon make actual steps in order to implement it, which ended up with the disengagement from Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. I actually remember that George Bush was suddenly taken as not our friend by many.
He began to, the public opinion shifted when he decided to not only to argue for this, but also to punish Israel for this in the guarantees affair. And this is quite true, but I'm not talking only about, the disagreements. What's so funny that actually Donald Trump froze the settlements, right? And now the Ribonut affair, right?
Yeah.
The annexation.
The annexation. And this went smoothly, even though the roadmap of the Abrahamic agreement now is almost completely as the map of that Netanyahu spoke about in his Bar-Ilan speech.
Yeah, that's true.
And it goes as a partnership. But you are, of course, right that there are also very deep argues between most Israelis or the elected government in Israel and the administration in the States. But if I look at the Democratic Party, I'm quite concerned. Congresswomen like Omar and Congresswoman Tlaib, and even Bernie Sanders, right, refusing to give the speech in the AIPAC gathering, and identifying himself as a Polish Jew and being a nominee that is very much supported by Jewish votes, it is disturbing, and it is deeper than our disagreements that can be continued to discuss. And I look for the day after Netanyahu, and the question is, what constellation would we face then, the day after, when Israeli society will change, or when now, and hopefully when America will be led by a democratic representative.
Okay, I want to move on and ask about Israeli and American civil society. And to say that some liberal American Jews are worried about the fabric of American civil society in this area, rising concerns such as the transition of power between administrations, about police violence, about gerrymandering, about the danger perhaps of on civil liberties and civil rights. And I want to ask you if you see a connection between the health of the civil society in the US and the health of the civil society in Israel. Are we as concerned, and what differences can you discern between these two? Masua, perhaps you would like to begin?
So thanks. We talked, about how everything is politicized and polarized these days. And I want to share with you a social initiative I'm involved with in Israel called the Israeli Congress. Conducted a large survey in Israel a few months ago and found that about 50% of young Israelis will not date someone from the other ideological side. I'm not talking here Jewish, non-Jewish, or religious secular, but I'm talking right and left. And last week, I talked about this survey with my students, law school students, and told them I was really surprised by these results. And one by one, this diverse group of law school students told me, I get that. I would probably say the same. And this was in a class that was dedicated to diversity and pluralism in Israel, meaning this is a group that already have a tendency towards diversity. So these days, it seems that the ideological debate between conservatism and liberalism is what tears us apart. And you're talking about civil society and civil rights. And I think Supreme Court justices are a good example for this, both in America and in Israel. So Amy Coney Barrett was just nominated to the American Supreme Court 2 seconds before the election, and Democrats feel as though the seat was unfairly stolen, and Republicans say, well, you started it. And in Israel, the justices' identity and agenda are constantly discussed and compared. Now, Barrett's religious faith and practice have come under scrutiny in the period leading up to the confirmation hearings. And in Israel, among the justices, but not only there, being more religious does not necessarily mean being more conservative. So the justices are not categorized by the public on whether they are religious or not, but on whether they are liberal or conservative. Today on the bench, 4 out of the 15 presiding justices are practicing Orthodox, but they are split, 2 of them liberal and 2 of them conservative. But having said that, and now we're going back a bit to the political culture and religious culture in Israel, I want to say something about religion and judicial decision-making in Israel. A couple of years ago, I asked Justice Neil Handel about the role of sources of religious law in judicial decision-making. And he started with a beautiful story about his days as a district court judge. He told about a case in which he ruled that the defendant was guilty in theft. When he announced the verdict, the defendant's family started going crazy and the defendant started yelling in the courtroom. And then the judge said, and this is also true according to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's ruling. And then he stated the ruling, and he describes the courtroom instantly becoming quiet and the defendant lowering his head. Now, in a time when religion is dominant in people's lives, as in Israel, the use of religious justifications by the court, even if these justifications are not required in order to reach the judicial decision. So this is something, as opposed to Coney Barrett's nomination, this is something that expresses respect to people's identity. And perhaps it's the same in the US also. Perhaps it's something that expresses again, the respect to people's identity, and gives legitimacy to the judicial product in the eyes of many, because using the principles of the religious law under the democratic framework holds the potential to strengthen the democratic character of religion. So if a lot of people today are worried about the democratic values in Israel and civil society in Israel, then the use in these it's not using it's not using and throwing away, but it's an authentic use of religious justifications to strengthen the character, the democratic character of religion. And this is really the Hartman project in a time when religion is strengthening and democracy is weakening. This project is especially important. Not that I'm saying that an Israeli Supreme Court justice is promoting the Hartman project, so please don't quote me on this. And for me, this is the way to deal with the growing gaps in both our societies. I don't want anyone to be silenced. I want to hear everyone's voices, but I go back to Shraga's talk before. We need to conduct our public debates with emphasis on our shared values, whether it is Israeli society, American society, or the Jewish people. And that's exactly what Justice Handel does. He's deciding according to his interpretation of the law, but he illustrates how his interpretation is consistent with Jewish halakha. Of course, people may disagree with his halachic interpretation, but it's the language that he uses that mark his belonging to the crowd and to the traditional Israeli society.
Can I say, Masua, I'm hearing you, and you know, two very strong emotions are rising in me. On one hand, yes, I think it's beautiful. I think, yes, that's the way to go. You need to use the language of our tradition. You need to base yourself on it even when it's possible. I mean, just to say it's also possible, and to embrace it, and actually it's simply a part of our language. So it's even foolish not to dive deep into those sources and raise buckets full of these of what we have there. Yes. On the other hand, I do have to say there is a fundamental difference between the way our tradition functions and the way, let's say, Amy Coney Barrett's tradition functions. And that is that our tradition has a body of law. We have an interpretive and elaborate, a very, very detailed body of law. And not only that, we have courthouses, religious courthouses, which rabbis and dayanim sit in. And not only that, these religious courthouses do not recognize, fundamentally, in principle, the authority of the civil courthouses of Israel. So there is, I think there is no, but you can mention maybe one or two names of Orthodox rabbis, let's say major Orthodox rabbis, who today recognize, in principle, the authority of civil courts in Israel. So yes, they use them, obviously, and sometimes are used, are summoned to them without any choice, but they don't recognize their authority. So when Neil Handel or Solberg or any other justice uses that language, and again, I think it's appropriate and it's certainly beneficial, but we have to remember these are competing structures of law, competing systems of law that at the end, one of them does not recognize the other. Well, you can say vice versa, of course, but in the end, certainly there will be a lot of halachic decrees that the civil court cannot accept. Off the top of my head, inheritance laws, like the halakha, the Orthodox halakha, men inherit more than women. Of course, we can't have that in the Israel democracy, and so not seldom will the civil courts have to say, yes, the halakha is that way, but we're ruling in a completely different way, right? Shraga, what do you think?
I think that you are, of course, right. I don't know if Masua, do you want to comment, to respond?
I'll just
This
say
is more your field.
I'll just say one sentence. A lot of halachic decrees are inconsistent with other halachic decrees. So that I'm not worried about that. I mean, it's a legal system as other legal systems. So that's not something I'm worried about. I'm not sure I agree about the recognition of authority, but I'm putting that aside. I just want, if we can, what I wanted to emphasize here is the shared values. That when you produce either your criticism or your decision-making or the way you go out to the public and convince them that you're their ally, if you do it based on shared values, it's completely different than if you go from the outside and say, that's how I think you should act, you're doing it wrong. It's completely different than from saying, okay, we're in this together. This is our society, this is our tradition. And you know as well as I do that I can bring every justification I want to everything I want generally to say. And that's true in each legal system. Sorry, Shraga, you go ahead.
Yeah, I will say the same, will have the same response that you told me, that you have responded to me last time. I think that you are not talking only about rhetoric, you are talking about very deep integration between languages and building a basis for solidarity. And so I would love to weigh in from a different angle to this challenge of integration. We have to mend the political division in the States and in Israel, and there is a strong correlation between education and humanistic values. And in light of this, the obvious thing is to mobilize a tremendous effort to make a quality education accessible to all sections of the population. In addition, the system which allows for a deep disconnect between money and values must be changed. Money may help promote values, but it can neither buy nor replace them. And the most important challenge, and perhaps the most difficult of all, is the effort required from us, from people who enjoy economic stability and enjoy education, to open our hearts and to actually realize the value of equality that we have learned and teach through as broad an integration as possible. It is contrary to our natural tendency to connect with those like us. We need to create more and more frameworks of true pluralism, of different lifestyles that manage to meet each other. And sometimes we have to compromise. Sometimes we have to slow the changes that we want to promote in order to protect the solidarity, the group as a whole. And I believe that integration, as you said, between religious law and between secular law, integration between people from different economist structure, the integration also between, as you said, conservatives and liberal, is crucial for the future of our solidarity.
I totally agree. And actually, I want to pick up on this point of solidarity and say something that a thought that I've had for a very long time. And this connects about the civil society in Israel as opposed to the US. And this connects to my opening remarks about the different, conception and actual physical reality of the two societies coming into being. I've always thought that, contrary to the US, in Israel, the levels of inherent natural solidarity between Jewish Israelis, I'm talking about, are way up there. Are simply, I mean, the comparison is almost, you know, not serious, because obviously, as again I said before, as I said in the beginning, these people see themselves fundamentally as part of an extended family, the Jewish people, right? And an extended family that predates any bureaucratic and national organization that came into being in 1948, right? And so there is a certain basic level of solidarity that for a long time I've thought we can take for granted almost. And also not only because we as Jews have a very thick and painful even memory of civil strife between ourselves, of civil war, of sinat chinam, right? And which led to actual disasters in our past. And so, like, if we take an issue like police violence, I think it's not by chance that generally there is much less police violence, correct me if I'm wrong, that's what I think, in Israel than in the US. I think there are, at least, of course, when we're talking about Jewish demonstrations or Jewish civil unrest, I'm not talking, and of course, this is the flip side, right? When you're closer to your own social group, other social groups or other ethnic groups seem more distant, and there's less solidarity between you and them. But there is this advantage that at least between the majority of Israeli citizens who are Jews, there is this basic solidarity, which I think is hard or harder to find between just any two random US citizens, which, yes, consider themselves citizens of the same state, but not naturally a part of the same extended family. Wouldn't you think so? Masua, I think I mean, but
no, I tried to tell Shraga with my eyes, you go first.
Because I mean, I'm picking up from you notes of dissent.
Shraga, you go first.
I agree that, of course, when we talk about a developed national identity, there is something that helps the unity. I think that America used to have this kind of solidarity. I lived in the States in 2013, 2014, and it started to this, gap and political culture started to raise. But basically, for many years, my teacher and rabbi, Professor David Hartman, of blessed memory, told me, you should go to America and you should see what pluralism is. When I went there, this is a kind of pluralism of live and let live that used to mark American society. It doesn't contain the bond that you have described, right? But it adds other values that actually created tolerated society with the solidarity of we, the American, the empire. I saw Obama, how many times in his speeches he used to say, do it for your president, for your nation. How many flags were on the podium of in those, great speeches of Obama. So solidarity is something that nations are able to create. But,
certainly.
But it has been turned off, I think, also in Israel. And when it starts to decline, you see more police violence as well. and you see more violence also between different sectors in each society.
Yeah.
And I think here the mission to repair, to regain solidarity is something that doesn't come by its own. I remember Rabbi Rick Jacobs, saying so lovely that in Israel is too small and has too many challenges that you must experience solidarity and you must experience pluralism, because in the same tank, in the army, you will find 4 different guys, and they're related, of course, to the tank of Ryan and Uri Grossman of blessed memory, that you serve together. It's not a pluralism of live and let live. It's a pluralism of shared fate, and as you said, shared destiny. And here I think you are completely right.
Masua,
I'll just say that
coming to a close, so also have your final remarks added here.
I'll just say that I agree with you on principle, but we can't ignore that in recent years, this solidarity has been deteriorating. And I think, you know, the survey I mentioned and another an agreement index also published last year by the Israeli Congress says most of the Israelis are in deep disagreement with one each other, but they really want to agree. They really want to be united. They want the solidarity, but they don't know how to go there, how to get there. And I think one of the problems, perhaps, is the fact that we have at least 3 belonging groups. So we have Jews in Israel. We are a part of the Jews in Israel. We have Israelis, that we are the Israeli civilization. Okay, we're citizens, and we are Jews generally, both Israelis and the Jewish people. And I think that crossroads are can be helpful and can also be a challenge to our solidarity. Because you don't really know in which case you belong to what group and according to what you decide. But I agree completely with both of you on the principle, and Shraga, I agree that solidarity needs actual steps to be mended. And this is true both to Israel and to the United States, where the rift among Jews, even, let's just talk about the rift among Jews is growing. So I go back again, it's like a chant. Shared values, I think, is the key.
Shared values, and maybe I would add, and we're really coming to a close, we need to, you know, it's banal, and I don't want to throw the responsibility on someone else, but we do need a leadership that also places these values at its core. That's something that's important to it. A leadership, I mean, as you said, people want that solidarity. People want to mend the rifts, and that's, and I mean, I think that's tremendously important, that there isn't this actual wish to be together. But if the leadership does not want to mend the rifts, but wants to use the rifts for its own political gain, obviously it will do its best to keep those rifts alive and even, you know, pulsating and bubbling. And we have what we have right now in both countries. We have a rift that is getting wider and wider open. Shraga, would you like to add a final thought?
Just wish us, this is democracy. Democracy, we vote for them.
Yeah.
And I think that you are right, completely right, but it is our responsibility to help the situation change. And I really wish that we will be allies from both sides of the ocean, and we will work for it, for the future of the Jewish people and of this linkage between Jewish and democratic state in Israel and the culture in the States together.
Yes. So we've got an election a few days away in the US, probably a few months away in Israel, as it looks like now. So let's hope for some good results, some good developments. You're basically saying vote, Shraga. So yes, so and I think we should, and let's hope for the best. And
we are blessed that we are living in a society that we are able to influence our lives.
Certainly so. Most societies aren't and weren't. Great. Thank you both. Thank you, Masua Sagiv, and thank you, Shraga Bar-On. I'm Tomer Persico, and hope to see you soon, all of you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.